By sunrise, Manhattan no longer looked like a city Damien Moretti owned. It looked like a city preparing to bury him. Every screen from Wall Street cafes to courthouse lobbies was flashing leaked St. Holdings files, offshore accounts, casino transfers, false charity foundations, sealed hospital records, judges' payments, police favors, and the names of men who had smiled beside children at fundraisers while quietly selling those same children's futures to criminals in tailored suits. Claire stood inside Damien's penthouse server room with Elena's silver necklace cold against her throat, her hand still hovering above the keyboard she had used to release her mother's evidence to the world. She had imagined revenge would feel hot, violent, satisfying. Instead, it felt silent. Too silent. Like the second after a glass falls, but before it hits the floor. Behind her, Luca Ferraro shut down the backup terminal with calm precision, his charcoal coat dusted with concrete ash, his face unreadable. Matteo stood near the door, pale and restless, listening to 3 radios at once while pretending not to watch Damien. But Claire watched him. Damien Moretti stood near the glass wall overlooking Manhattan, black shirt sleeves rolled to his forearms, tattoos visible along his hands, his jaw unshaven, his eyes fixed not on the collapsing city below, but on her. This was the empire his father built, the empire Isabella inherited, the empire Damien ruled from the shadows for years, and he had let Claire destroy its spine with one click. "Say something," she whispered, because the silence between them had become harder to bear than sirens. Damien's mouth moved once before sound came. "Your mother finally won." The words should have healed something in Claire, but they only made the room colder. Elena had won, yes, but Elena was still dead, Claire's childhood was still a lie, and Damien was still the man standing between her grief and the bloodline that caused it. On the monitor wall, news anchors repeated his name again and again. Criminal. Witness. Traitor. Kingpin. Informant. Monster. Lover. They didn't know what to call a man who burned his own throne because the woman he loved deserved the truth more than he deserved power. Damien stepped toward Claire, then stopped before touching her, because he had learned the difference between protection and possession too late, but not too late to try. "They will come for you now," he said. Claire gave a small exhausted laugh. "They already did." His eyes darkened. "This time they won't come with guns first. They'll come with lawyers, fake evidence, missing records, dead witnesses, rewritten history. They'll try to turn Elena into a liar and you into a weapon." Claire stared at him. "And what will they turn you into?" Damien looked through the glass at Manhattan, glowing gold and guilty beneath the morning light. "Whatever they need me to be." The door opened behind them. Matteo entered, holding a phone like it had become dangerous. "Damien," he said, no longer using Voss, and that alone felt like the empire cracking. "Federal units are moving. Moretti loyalists too. And Isabella sent a message." Claire's pulse tightened. "What does she want?" Matteo looked at Damien. "She says if you want the truth about Elena's final night, come before the city reaches you." Damien closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, Claire saw it clearly. He was not afraid of losing the empire. He was afraid the truth would make her leave before he could burn the rest of it for her. The Roosevelt Library had always been built to preserve history, not to correct it, yet that morning it stood like a courtroom waiting for a verdict no one would survive. Damien arrived without the usual convoy, without the armor of his name, walking through the marble entrance with Claire beside him and Matteo trailing behind, every step echoing louder than it should have, as if the building itself knew something irreversible was about to unfold. Dust floated through beams of pale light, the renovation leaving the place half forgotten, half exposed, like a secret dragged too close to the surface. Isabella Moretti stood beneath the stained-glass dome, dressed not like the untouchable queen of a criminal empire, but like a woman who had already buried everything she once believed in, her cream suit simple, her hair pulled back, her expression unreadable until Damien stopped in front of her and the silence between them turned personal. Claire didn't hide behind him this time. She stood slightly to his side, not protected, not claimed, simply present, and Isabella noticed that immediately, a faint smile touching her lips as if she recognized something familiar in that quiet defiance. "You finally came," Isabella said softly, her voice carrying across the empty hall, and Damien answered just as quietly, "You finally told the truth, because there was no point pretending anymore." Matteo shifted behind them, uneasy, his hand never far from his weapon, even though this didn't feel like a place where bullets would be the first attack. Isabella stepped forward and placed a small recorder on the long oak table between them. The sound of it touching was sharper than any gunshot. "Elena recorded everything," she said, her eyes flicking briefly toward Claire, "including the moment your life was decided without you." Claire felt her breath tighten as Isabella pressed play, and the room filled with static before Elena's voice emerged, calm but strained, speaking in Italian, bargaining not for herself but for her daughter, for Clara, for a future she already knew she wouldn't live to see. Damien didn't move, but Claire saw his hand curl slowly into a fist as another voice joined the recording, colder, heavier, unmistakably Antonio Moretti, explaining power the way monsters explain gravity, as something inevitable, something deserved. Then came the moment that rewrote everything Damien believed about himself, his younger voice breaking through the recording, desperate, arguing, pleading, not as a boss, not as a son of power, but as a boy who hadn't yet learned what his family really was. And Antonio gave him a choice that was never meant to be a choice at all, Elena or Isabella, life or blood, and Claire felt the room tilt as she realized Damien had been shaped by a lie built to break both sides of that decision. The recording cut abruptly, leaving only silence, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was heavier, sharper, filled with the weight of everything that had been hidden. Damien looked at Isabella, not with anger, not with control, but with something dangerously close to grief. "He told me you were dead," he said, his voice low, almost unrecognizable. Isabella nodded once, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the years beneath it. "And he told me you chose her over me," she replied, the words landing between them like a wound reopened after too long. Claire didn't speak, couldn't speak, because in that moment she understood something worse than betrayal. She understood design, that every pain, every loss, every decision Damien had ever made had been engineered long before he had the power to question it. And for the first time, she saw him not as the man who had protected her, not as the man tied to her mother's death, but as something far more dangerous and far more fragile, someone who had been built by the same system he now stood on the edge of destroying. Matteo's phone vibrated again, sharp and urgent, breaking the moment as he stepped closer, his voice low but tense. "We've got movement outside. Multiple vehicles. No plates." Luca, who had appeared without anyone noticing, moved toward the entrance with the calm certainty of a man who never reacted late. Isabella didn't turn. She kept her eyes on Damien. "They're coming for the last thing your father never controlled," she said quietly. Damien didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. Claire felt it too, the shift in the air, the moment where truth stopped being information and became a decision. Damien reached for her hand without thinking, his grip firm, grounding, not asking for permission but not demanding anything either, and for the first time since the night she took a bullet for him, Claire didn't pull away. They didn't wait for permission. The first shot shattered the glass above the reading hall, and everything that had been quiet seconds before collapsed into motion. Not chaos, execution. The old guard moved like men who had nothing left to negotiate, only something left to protect, and that something was buried deeper than money. Damien didn't reach for Claire this time to shield her. He moved with her, pulling her slightly to his side instead of behind him, his body angled just enough to take the first line of fire while still keeping her within reach. Matteo overturned a heavy oak table with a grunt, dragging it into position as splinters burst from the surface under impact, his voice sharp, controlled, "We're not holding this room." Luca was already gone from sight, slipping into the shadows between columns with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent his entire life ending problems before they spoke. Isabella didn't panic. She stepped back, watching the attackers with something colder than fear, recognition. "They're not here for you," she said to Claire, her voice steady even as bullets cracked through the air. "They're here for what Elena left behind." Claire's hand instinctively tightened around the necklace at her throat, the only thing she had carried from a life that wasn't hers until it was too late. Damien heard it, saw it, understood it, and in that moment his priorities shifted again, not toward survival, but toward protection of something he could not afford to lose twice. He fired once, precise, controlled, forcing the closest attacker back just long enough to create space. "Move," he said, not loudly, not urgently, but with a certainty that made hesitation impossible. They didn't run blindly. Damien led them through a side corridor he had memorized years ago when the library had been used for meetings no one admitted existed, his hand never leaving Claire's wrist, not gripping, not claiming, but anchoring. Like if he let go, she would disappear into the same past that had already taken too much. Behind them, Matteo covered their retreat, each shot calculated, each movement efficient, but even he knew this wasn't a fight they were meant to win here. It was a delay, a narrowing of time. Luca reappeared ahead of them as if he had always been there, pushing open a service door that led to a maintenance stairwell spiraling downward into darkness. "They anticipated the upper exits," he said calmly. "They didn't expect you to go below." Damien didn't question it. He trusted Luca the way men only trust someone who has never failed them when failure meant death. Claire followed, her breath uneven now, not from fear, but from the weight of what was happening, because for the first time she wasn't being protected from the truth, she was moving through it. Halfway down the stairs, she spoke, her voice cutting through the echo. "The vault," she said. Damien didn't slow, but his grip tightened slightly. "You don't know what you're asking." Claire shook her head, even though he couldn't see it. "No, I finally do." That answer changed something again. Not in the situation. In him. Because this wasn't the girl he had tried to keep safe by controlling the world around her. This was someone choosing to step into it, knowing exactly what it would cost. When they reached the lower level, the air shifted, colder, heavier, carrying the quiet hum of something built to outlast everything above it. Damien stopped in front of a reinforced steel door, old, unmarked, invisible unless you knew where to look. For a second, no one spoke. The sound of pursuit echoed faintly above them, growing closer. Matteo glanced back once. "We have maybe 2 minutes." Damien looked at the door, then at Claire. There was no hesitation left in his eyes now. Only clarity. "This is where it ends," he said quietly. Claire met his gaze without flinching. "No," she said. "This is where you choose." And for the first time since the world started collapsing around him, Damien Moretti didn't look like a man trying to survive it. He looked like a man ready to decide what deserved to survive him. The door didn't look like power. It looked like silence. Thick steel, no markings, no handle visible unless you knew exactly where to press, where to trust memory over instinct. Damien stepped forward, his hand hovering for a fraction of a second before pressing against the hidden mechanism, and the vault responded not with noise, but with a slow, deliberate release, like something ancient deciding whether it should still exist. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder, boots hitting concrete, voices low and coordinated, men who had been doing this long enough to understand that hesitation meant death. Matteo exhaled sharply. 30 seconds. Luca didn't move, his attention fixed on the corridor above, buying them time. Without asking if it would be enough. Claire stepped closer as the door opened just enough to let cold air escape, different from the air above, heavier, untouched, preserved. She felt it before she saw anything, the weight of something that wasn't just hidden, but protected, like Elena had built this place not to store information, but to bury truth where only someone willing to face it could reach it. Damien didn't step inside immediately. He turned toward Claire instead, his expression unreadable, but his eyes clear in a way they hadn't been before. "Once we go in," he said quietly, "there's no version of this where things stay the same." Claire held his gaze without hesitation. They were never going to. That answer was enough. It wasn't permission. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something stronger, understanding. Damien nodded once and stepped into the vault. The lights flickered on automatically, revealing rows of sealed cases, documents stacked with precision, photographs, recordings, everything Saint Holdings had ever tried to hide in places no one could legally search. But this wasn't just their archive. This was Elena's answer. Claire moved forward slowly, her breath catching as she saw her mother's handwriting on the first case, labeled simply with a name she hadn't heard spoken in years. Clara. Not Claire. Not the life she had built to survive. The truth she had been forced to forget. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing files cross-referenced, dates marked, signatures undeniable, proof layered so deeply it couldn't be erased without destroying everything connected to it. Mateo stepped in behind them, eyes scanning, calculating. This ends them, he said, almost in disbelief. Luca remained near the door, listening, counting seconds like currency. Damien didn't touch the files. He didn't need to. He knew what they were. He knew what they meant. This was power in its purest form. Not money. Not violence. Control over truth. And for the first time, he didn't reach for it. Claire looked up at him, searching his face for something she couldn't name. What do we do with it? She asked. It wasn't a question about strategy. It was a question about who he was going to be. Damien stepped closer, stopping just short of her again, that same restraint, that same distance he had learned too late but held on to now like it mattered. You tell the truth, he said. Claire frowned slightly. That's not how this world works. Damien's expression didn't change. It is today. Mateo turned sharply. Damien, if we release all of this, there's nothing left to bargain with. No leverage. No protection. Luca added quietly, no return. The weight of that hung in the air. Claire looked between them, then back at Damien. And if we don't? She asked. Damien finally looked at the files, then back at her. Then everything your mother died for becomes another story they bury. The sound of boots grew louder. Closer. Time collapsing. Claire's hand tightened around the edge of the case. Then we don't bury it, she said. That was the moment. Not the fire. Not the fall. The choice. Damien studied her for a long second, and in that silence, everything he had been and everything he could become balanced on one decision. Then he moved. Not toward the files. Toward the far wall. Mateo frowned. What are you doing? Damien didn't answer. He opened a sealed compartment hidden behind reinforced panels and pulled out something small. A lighter. Simple. Ordinary. Completely out of place in a room built for secrets. Claire's breath caught slightly. Damien, he looked at her. No hesitation. No doubt. If we use this, he said, nodding toward the files, we become them. Mateo stepped forward. If you destroy it, we lose everything. Damien shook his head once. No, he said quietly. We lose control. He flicked the lighter. The flame didn't hesitate. It touched the edge of the first file, and for a moment nothing happened, as if even fire needed to understand what it had been asked to do. Then the paper curled inward and the ink began to bleed, names dissolving into something that could no longer be used, no longer be traded, no longer be weaponized. Mateo moved first, instinct overriding loyalty for a split second, stepping forward as if he could still stop it, as if years of survival built on leverage could rewrite what was already happening. Damien, stop, this is everything, he said, his voice tight, not with fear, but with disbelief, because men like them didn't destroy power, they held it, they shaped it, they survived by it. Damien didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Exactly, he said quietly, and that single word carried more finality than any command he had ever given. The fire spread faster now, climbing through stacked decades of secrets, devouring signatures, transactions, histories rewritten in real time, turning control into ash. Claire didn't move. She stood where she was, watching the only system that had ever defined her life collapse in front of her, and for the first time, she didn't feel small inside it. She felt outside it, free of it. But that freedom came with a cost she could already feel forming. Luca stepped closer to the vault entrance, his head tilting slightly as he listened, calculating distance, timing, outcomes, his voice low but certain. They're 20 seconds out. Matteo ran a hand through his hair, pacing once before stopping, eyes locked on Damien. We could have used this. We could have controlled them all. Damien finally looked at him, really looked at him, not as a soldier, not as a right hand, but as someone who had survived the same world. And then what? He asked. Matteo didn't answer, because there was no answer that didn't lead back to the same place they had just burned. The fire reached the central cases now, the ones marked in Elena's handwriting, the ones meant for Claire, and she felt her chest tighten as she stepped forward without thinking, stopping just short of the flames, her eyes searching for something to save, something to keep. But there was nothing left that wouldn't tie her back to the same system her mother had died trying to break. Damien moved then, not to stop the fire, not to pull her away, but to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat from both the flames and him, his voice quieter now, almost lost in the sound of burning paper. I'm not saving it this time, he said. Claire turned her head slightly toward him. I know. That was the difference. Before, she had needed him to protect her. Now, she understood what he was destroying for her. The alarms above them began to scream, louder, closer, no longer distant, no longer irrelevant, and Matteo swore under his breath as he moved toward the exit. We need to go. Now. Luca didn't wait for agreement. He opened the vault door fully, smoke beginning to push outward into the corridor, carrying with it the smell of everything that had once controlled the city. Damien didn't move immediately. He watched the fire a second longer, just enough to make sure there was no version of this where it could be undone. Then he turned, his hand finding Claire's again, not pulling, just asking, and she followed without resistance. As they stepped out, Luca sealed the door behind them, locking the fire inside like a final decision that could never be reversed. The corridor was no longer quiet. Footsteps were close now, voices sharper, the old guard realizing too late that the thing they had come to protect was already gone. Matteo led the way this time, fast, efficient, guiding them through the narrow passage toward the surface, but the tension had shifted, no longer about escape, but about consequence. Because this wasn't just destruction. This was declaration. When they reached the final stairwell, Damien slowed slightly, just enough to look back once, not at the vault, not at the Empire, but at the choice he had made, and Claire saw it clearly then. He hadn't burned the Empire because he lost control of it. He burned it because he refused to let it take her too. They didn't make it out clean. The moment they reached the upper level, the illusion of escape collapsed under reality, because the world above had already changed. Federal lights cut through the street outside the library windows, red and blue reflections slicing across marble floors and shattered glass, turning the entire building into something between a crime scene and a confession. Matteo slowed first, instinctively scanning exits, angles, numbers, calculating survival like he always had, but this time there was no clear path forward, only consequences closing in from every direction. We're surrounded, he said under his breath, not panicked. Just stating fact, because panic never helped anyone live longer. Luca stepped beside him, eyes moving once across the space before settling. Not surrounded, he corrected quietly. Contained. That difference mattered. Damien didn't stop walking. His grip on Claire's hand loosened slightly, not letting go, but no longer pulling her forward, as if he was giving her the choice to walk beside him or turn away before the final line was crossed. Claire felt it immediately. That shift. That permission. She could leave. She could disappear into the chaos, into the truth that now belonged to the world instead of the people who tried to bury it. She could survive without him. For a single second, the thought existed. Then it was gone. She didn't let go. They stepped out together. The cold air hit first, sharp, real, nothing like the sealed silence of the vault below, and the sound followed, sirens, shouted orders, the controlled chaos of a city reacting too late to something that had already happened. Agents moved toward them, weapons raised but uncertain, because even now, they didn't know what Damien Moretti was anymore. Target. Witness. Threat. Solution. All of it. None of it. Matteo stopped a few steps behind, his loyalty pulling him forward even as logic told him to stay back. Luca didn't move at all, already existing at the edge of disappearance, ready to become a ghost again the moment this crossed into something he couldn't control. Claire looked at Damien. Really looked at him. No shadows. No distance. Just a man who had burned everything that defined him and was now standing in the aftermath with nothing left but the choice of what came next. "This is where it ends," she said quietly. Damien shook his head once, almost imperceptible. "No," he said. "This is where it's counted." Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands. Not surrender. Not weakness. Decision. The agents moved faster now, closing the distance, voices sharper, commands clearer, weapons lowering just enough to match the shift in posture, because even power recognized when another kind of power chose not to fight it. Matteo exhaled hard, tension leaving his body in a way it hadn't in years. "He's really doing it," he muttered. Luca watched without expression, but there was something there, something like acknowledgement, because even he understood what it meant for a man like Damien to stop. Claire didn't step away when they reached him. She stayed close, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, close enough that anyone watching would understand this wasn't coincidence, this wasn't circumstance, this was choice. Damien glanced at her once, just once, and in that look was everything he couldn't say, everything he had already given up, everything he was about to lose. "You should go," he said quietly, not as an order, not as protection, but as truth. Claire shook her head. "No," she answered. Simple. Final. The agents reached them then, hands moving, restraints ready, the world closing in exactly as it always had for men like him. But this time Damien didn't resist. He didn't negotiate. He didn't control the outcome. He let it happen. Because for the first time in his life, he had already made the only decision that mattered. And as the cold metal closed around his wrists, Claire understood something that didn't need words. He hadn't burned the empire to save himself. He burned it so she would never have to belong to it again. The city didn't slow down for him. It never had. Even as Damien Moretti was pushed into the back of a federal vehicle, surrounded by agents who still weren't entirely sure whether they had just arrested a criminal or secured a witness, Manhattan kept moving, indifferent, relentless, as if power changing hands was just another routine shift in gravity. Claire stood where he had left her, not restrained, not questioned yet, because no one knew what to do with her either. She wasn't part of the empire. She wasn't separate from it. She was the reason it no longer existed. Matteo hovered nearby, tension still wired into every movement, eyes scanning everything out of habit even though there was no longer anything left to defend. Luca was already gone. No one saw him leave. No one ever did. That was the difference between survival and disappearance. Claire watched as Damien sat inside the vehicle, hands restrained in front of him, posture straight, expression unreadable, but there was no fight left in him, no calculation, no shifting angles, just stillness, the kind that came after a decision had already been made and nothing else could change it. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass. No words. No gestures. Just understanding. Then the door closed, cutting him off from the world he had ruled and the one he had just destroyed. The convoy moved, slow at first, then faster, disappearing into the city that had once belonged to him. Claire didn't move until it was gone. Only then did the weight of everything settle fully, not as shock, not as fear, but as something quieter, heavier, something that didn't ask for reaction because it had already taken what it needed. An agent approached her carefully, as if she might break or disappear if handled incorrectly. "Claire Bennett," he asked. She didn't correct him. "Not yet. We're going to need you to come with us," he continued, his tone professional but uncertain, because he was standing in front of someone who had just dismantled a system he barely understood. Claire nodded once. "I know." Matteo stepped forward slightly. "She's not part of this," he said, the words automatic, protective even now. The agent didn't argue, but he didn't step back either. "That's not for you to decide." Claire placed a hand lightly on Matteo's arm, stopping him before he could push further. "It's fine," she said quietly. Matteo looked at her, searching for something, a sign, an order, Anything that would tell him what came next, but there was nothing left to follow. Not anymore. Claire stepped toward the waiting vehicle without hesitation. This wasn't surrender. This wasn't fear. This was consequence. As she sat down inside, the door closing behind her with a solid final sound, she realized something that had been building since the moment Damien lit the flame in the vault. This wasn't the end of his story. It wasn't even the end of hers. It was the end of the system that had written both of them into roles they never chose. And now, for the first time, there was nothing left to hide behind. No empire. No lies. No protection. Just truth. And whatever it demanded next. The interrogation room wasn't designed to break people. It was designed to wait them out. Claire noticed that immediately. No harsh lights. No raised voices. Just a quiet table, a recorder, and 2 agents who looked more like accountants than hunters. It made everything feel slower. Heavier. Like the truth would surface not because it was forced, but because there was nowhere left for it to hide. Claire sat across from them, Elena's necklace resting against her collarbone, the only thing she had kept from the past that had just been burned into ash. "State your name for the record," one of the agents said, his tone neutral, practiced. Claire paused. Just long enough to feel the weight of both identities pressing against her. "Claire Bennett," she said first, then added, "Clara de Luca." The second name shifted the room. Subtle. But real. Pens paused. Eyes lifted. Because that name still meant something in places the public would never see. "And your connection to Damien Moretti?" the agent asked. Claire didn't look away. "I'm the reason he burned his empire." It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't pride. It was truth, and it landed harder than anything else she could have said. The agents exchanged a glance, not disbelief, but recalculation, because suddenly this wasn't just a witness statement. It was a motive. Meanwhile, across the building, behind reinforced glass and federal protocol, Damien sat in his own room, hands free now, but still resting on the table as if the restraints had never been removed. He hadn't asked for a lawyer. He hadn't asked for a deal. He hadn't asked for anything. The agent across from him leaned forward slightly. "You understand the scale of what you've done?" Damien didn't answer immediately. He was looking at his hands, at the faint traces of ash still caught along the lines of his skin. "Yes," he said finally. "I ended it." The agent studied him. "You had control of the largest criminal network in the city." Damien looked up, his expression steady. "No," he corrected quietly. "It had control of me." That was the difference. That was the part they couldn't write into reports. The part that didn't fit into law. Hours. Passed like that. Questions. Answers. Silence. Truth unfolding not in dramatic revelations, but in small, irreversible confirmations. Claire spoke about Elena. About the files. About the system that had shaped everything. Damien spoke about Saint Holdings. About Antonio. About choices that were never choices. And somewhere between those 2 rooms, the narrative shifted. Not completely. Not cleanly. But enough. Enough for the people listening to realize this wasn't just a case. It was a collapse. Late that night, Claire was finally left alone, the door closing behind the last agent with a soft, final click. The room felt smaller now. Quieter. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering for the first time since the vault, since the fire, since everything. Then she heard it. Not loud. Not obvious. Just a subtle shift in the hallway outside, a movement that didn't belong to protocol. Claire didn't move immediately. She had learned that reacting too quickly could be more dangerous than not reacting at all. The door opened again. Not the same agent. Not the same posture. Luca stepped inside, closing the door behind him like he had never left the shadows. "You shouldn't be here," Claire said quietly. Luca tilted his head slightly. "Neither should half the people in this building," he replied. His eyes moved briefly around the room, then back to her. "This isn't over." Claire didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. "It never is," she said. Luca nodded once. "The old guard didn't come for the files," he added. "They came for what wasn't written." Claire felt her pulse tighten. "What does that mean?" Luca stepped closer, his voice lowering. "It means your mother didn't just leave evidence. He paused, just long enough to make sure she understood what was coming next. She left a failsafe. And, just like that, the ending shifted again. The word shouldn't have mattered. Failsafe. It sounded technical, distant, something built into systems, not people. But Claire felt it land like a second bullet, quieter, deeper, more dangerous, because it meant the story wasn't finished rewriting itself. She didn't ask Luca to explain again. She didn't need to. "Where is it?" she asked. Instead, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. Luca watched her for a moment, measuring not her fear, but her readiness, then nodded slightly. "Not a place," he said. "A trigger." That changed everything. Claire's mind moved quickly now, connecting fragments she hadn't understood before. Elena's recordings, the way the files were layered, the precision, the intention behind every detail. "What kind of trigger?" she asked. Luca stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "One that activates when St. Holdings collapses publicly." Claire felt the room tighten around her. "It already has." Luca's expression didn't change. "Exactly." Across the building, Damien was being escorted down a secured corridor, 2 agents on either side, their posture controlled, but their attention sharper now, because something had shifted in the information they were receiving. Radios whispered. Updates moved faster. Systems reacted. Damien didn't ask what was happening. He could feel it. The same way he had felt the moment the Empire crossed from control into collapse. The difference was this time, he didn't know where it would land. Back in the interrogation room, Claire stood slowly, her pulse steady but stronger now, not fear, not panic, but direction. "What does it do?" she asked. Luca didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and placed something small on the table. A flash drive. Plain. Unmarked. Dangerous. "Your mother didn't trust networks," he said. "She trusted timing." Claire stared at it. "What's on it?" Luca's eyes held hers. "The part they never wrote down. The part that doesn't just expose the system." He paused. "The part that destroys the people still trying to rebuild it." That was the difference between truth and consequence. Claire reached for the drive, but didn't pick it up yet. "If this is released," she began. Luca finished for her. "There's no version of the city that looks the same after." Silence filled the room again, but it wasn't empty this time. It was waiting. Claire finally took the drive, the cold metal grounding her more than anything else had since the vault. "Then why didn't she use it?" she asked. Luca's answer came without hesitation. "Because she was protecting you." That hit harder than everything else combined. Not because it was surprising. Because it made sense. Across the corridor, Damien was stopped abruptly, agents receiving new orders through tight voices and sharper commands. Something had triggered. Something they hadn't prepared for. One of them turned slightly toward him. "Looks like your story just got bigger," he muttered. Damien didn't respond. He was already thinking ahead. Already calculating what Claire would do when she understood what came next. Back in the room, Claire closed her hand around the drive. "If I use this, there's no going back." Luca tilted his head slightly. "There hasn't been for a long time." Claire exhaled slowly. Not hesitation. Not doubt. Decision forming again. "Then I don't use it for revenge," she said quietly. "I use it to end it." Luca nodded once. Approval. Not instruction. "Then you'll need him," he added. Claire looked up sharply. "Damien?" Luca stepped back toward the door. "He's the only one who knows how to make sure it doesn't turn into something worse." Claire's grip tightened. Because she understood what that meant. Not just exposing the truth. Controlling the aftermath. And Damien Moretti had just given up control of everything. The door opened. Luca was already gone before it fully closed. Claire stood alone again, the drive in her hand, the weight of the next decision pressing in. Because burning the Empire had been the first step. This would decide what rose from its ashes. The request didn't come through official channels. It never would have. Claire realized that the moment the agent returned, not with questions, but with hesitation, the kind that didn't belong in a system built on procedure. "He's willing to talk," the agent said carefully, like the words themselves carried risk. Claire didn't ask who. She already knew. Damien Moretti didn't ask for things. He decided them. The room felt smaller again as she stood, the flash drive still in her hand, its weight no longer physical but inevitable. Conditions, she asked. The agent shook his head slightly. Just you. That was enough to confirm it wasn't negotiation. It was something else. Something final. They walked her through corridors that felt colder than before, deeper inside a building designed to contain truths that didn't belong outside. Every step echoed with the awareness that this wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about what came after it. When the door opened, Damien was already there, seated, hands free, posture unchanged, like the world hadn't shifted around him even though it had. He looked up the moment she entered, and for a second, everything else disappeared. No agents. No walls. No consequences. Just the space between them and everything they had already lost to get here. The door closed behind her. Silence followed. Claire didn't sit immediately. She walked closer instead, stopping just across from him, close enough to see the faint traces of ash still along his skin, the last mark of the empire he had erased. You knew, she said quietly, not accusing, not questioning, just stating what had become obvious. Damien didn't deny it. I suspected, he replied. Your mother never built one layer of protection. She built 3. Claire tightened her grip slightly around the drive. There's more. Damien's eyes dropped briefly to her hand, then back to her face. There always is. That was the problem. That was why it never ended. Claire sat down slowly this time, placing the drive on the table between them, not hiding it, not offering it, just letting it exist. If I release this, she said, it won't just expose them. It will destroy everyone still connected. Damien nodded once. Yes. No hesitation. No softening. Just truth. Claire held his gaze, including people who never knew what they were part of. Damien didn't look away. That's what systems like this are built on. Silence settled again, heavier now, because this wasn't about what was right. It was about what would remain. Claire exhaled slowly. Then how do I end it without becoming them? Damien leaned back slightly, not distancing, but thinking, the way he used to before every move that mattered. You don't end it by destroying everyone, he said. You end it by making sure it can't rebuild. Claire frowned slightly. That's not the same thing. Damien's expression didn't change. It is if you know where to cut. That was the difference between chaos and control. Claire looked down at the drive, then back at him. And you know where that is? It wasn't a question. Damien met her eyes steadily. Yes. The word hung between them, heavy with everything it implied. Claire's voice softened, but didn't break. If I do this, there's no version of you that walks away from it. Damien almost smiled. Not with humor. With acceptance. There wasn't before, he said. Claire felt that land deeper than anything else. Because she knew he meant it. This wasn't sacrifice in the moment. This had been inevitable the second he chose her over power. She reached forward and slid the drive slightly closer to him. Then tell me where to cut. Damien didn't touch it. Not yet. His eyes stayed on hers, measuring, not her resolve, but her understanding. Once you start this, he said quietly, you don't get to stop halfway. Claire didn't hesitate. I know. That was enough. Damien finally reached forward, his fingers brushing the drive, not taking it, just acknowledging it. Then we do it right, he said. And, just like that, the final move began. They didn't move immediately. Not because they didn't know what to do, but because both of them understood that once they started, there would be no clean line between action and consequence anymore. Damien pulled the drive closer, finally taking it into his hand, turning it once as if weighing not the object, but everything attached to it. There are 3 points, he said, his voice calm, precise, the same tone he once used to dismantle entire networks without raising suspicion. Not names. Not faces. Infrastructure. Claire leaned forward slightly, every word anchoring her deeper into the decision she had already made. Tell me. Damien met her eyes. Financial arteries. Legal shields. And the people who rebuild what falls. Claire frowned faintly. The last one isn't a system. Damien shook his head once. It is. It's the part that learns. That was what made Saint Holdings dangerous. Not what it was, but how it adapted. Claire's fingers pressed lightly against the table. So we don't expose everything. Damien nodded. We expose enough to make the rest impossible to reassemble. The difference between collapse and extinction. Silence followed, but it wasn't uncertainty. It was calculation. Claire exhaled slowly. And the cost. Damien didn't hesitate. Me. He didn't say it dramatically. He didn't need to. Claire held his gaze, searching for anything that suggested hesitation. There was none. You're already in custody, she said quietly. Damien almost smiled again. That's not the cost. He leaned slightly forward now, lowering his voice even though no one was close enough to hear. When this goes out, I become the center point. The one who knew. The one who let it happen. The one they can all agree to destroy. Claire's chest tightened, but she didn't look away. And you're okay with that? Damien's answer came without pause. It's the only way it ends. That was the truth she couldn't change. The truth he had already accepted. Claire reached forward and placed her hand over the drive, her fingers brushing his for a brief second before she pulled it back, not lingering, not holding, just acknowledging what this meant between them. Then we do it your way, she said. Damien nodded once. No, he corrected. We do it the right way. Outside the room, systems were already reacting. Data requests. Emergency meetings. Quiet panic moving through channels that had never expected to be exposed. Inside, there was only clarity. Claire stood, taking the drive with her, the weight no longer uncertain, but chosen. She stopped at the door, her hand resting briefly against it before she turned back. Damien hadn't moved. He was watching her, not with control, not with possession, but with something quieter, something that had replaced both. This doesn't save you, she said. Damien shook his head slightly. That was never the point. Claire held his gaze one last time. I know. Then she opened the door and stepped out, carrying the final move with her. And for the first time since the Empire burned, Damien Moretti was no longer thinking about how to survive what came next. He was thinking about whether she would. It didn't explode. Across the world all at once. It unfolded. Quietly. Precisely. Like something that had been waiting not to be discovered, but to be released at exactly the right moment. Claire sat alone in a secured terminal room, the kind built for controlled leaks and irreversible decisions, Elena's necklace resting against her skin like a reminder that this had never been about exposure alone. The drive was already connected. The interface in front of her showed 3 pathways, just like Damien said. Financial arteries. Legal shields. Reconstruction networks. Each one branching into hundreds of names, systems, connections, all interwoven so tightly that pulling one without the others would only weaken, not destroy. Claire didn't rush. That was the difference now. This wasn't panic. This wasn't revenge. This was precision. Her fingers moved slowly across the keys, isolating nodes, cross-referencing patterns, watching how the system tried to protect itself even now, redirecting, masking, adapting. It was alive in the only way systems like this ever were. But not smarter than intent. Not this time. Outside the room, officials moved faster, voices tighter, agencies already feeling the first shifts, accounts freezing, communications dropping, quiet disappearances beginning where power had once felt untouchable. Inside, Claire made the first cut. Not the biggest. The most important. The legal shields. The ones that allowed everything else to exist without consequence. Judges. Shell institutions. The quiet agreements that turned crimes into paperwork. When those fell, the rest wouldn't have protection. The second cut came harder. Financial arteries. She watched as entire streams of money froze, rerouted, exposed, no longer hidden behind layers of distance and denial. Power didn't disappear. It stalled. And in that pause, it became vulnerable. The third path waited. Reconstruction. The people who would rebuild everything once the dust settled. Claire hovered there longer than the others. Because this wasn't about guilt. This was about potential. She didn't destroy them. She marked them. exposed just enough to remove their ability to operate unseen. That was the difference Damien had. Meant. Not total destruction. Permanent visibility. She leaned back slightly, exhaling as the system processed what she had done, the cascade beginning, not loud, not dramatic, but unstoppable. Across the city, across networks, across places that had never expected to be touched, the structure began to fail in ways that couldn't be reversed. Claire closed her eyes for a second. Not to rest. To feel it. The end of something that had defined her before she even knew her own name. When she opened them again, the final command waited. Release. No countdown. No confirmation. Just a choice. Claire pressed it. And the world shifted. The world didn't end. That was the strangest part. There was no single moment where everything collapsed into chaos, no dramatic silence, no instant justice. It shifted. Quietly. Permanently. Screens across the city lit up not with panic, but with confirmation. Accounts frozen. Warrants issued. Resignations submitted before names were even publicly called. The system didn't fall apart. It unraveled, thread by thread, because for the first time, it couldn't hide the pattern anymore. Claire stepped out of the terminal room into a hallway that no longer felt like containment. It felt like aftermath. Agents moved differently now, faster, sharper, but not in control. Not fully. Because control had been something borrowed, and now it was gone. She didn't stop walking until she reached the observation window at the far end, the one that overlooked the city Damien once ruled without ever being seen. Manhattan looked the same. Lights. Movement. Life continuing like it always did. But Claire knew better. The illusion had been broken. And once broken, it never returned the same way. Behind reinforced glass in another part of the building, Damien stood alone, no longer restrained, no longer questioned, because the questions had already been answered. He watched the same skyline, the same city, but from the other side of the ending he had chosen. An agent entered quietly. "It's done," he said. Damien didn't turn. "No," he replied. "It's visible." That was the difference. The agent hesitated. "They're building the case," he added. "Against you." Damien nodded once. "They should." No resistance. No negotiation. Just acceptance. Because this had never been about escaping consequence. It had been about choosing it. Hours later, Claire was escorted down the same corridor where everything had begun to change. This time, no hesitation. No uncertainty. Just clarity. She stopped outside Damien's door, her hand resting briefly against the cold surface before the agent stepped aside and opened it. Damien turned as she entered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to explain. Nothing left to justify. Just the space between them, filled with everything that had been lost and everything that had been chosen instead. Claire stepped closer, stopping just in front of him. "It's over," she said quietly. Damien studied her for a second, then shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "It's finished." That was the word that mattered. Not ended. Not destroyed. Finished. Claire let that settle, then asked the only question that still remained. "What happens to you now?" Damien didn't look away. "What was always going to happen," he answered. "No fear. No regret. Just truth." Claire's eyes softened, not with weakness, but with something deeper, something that had survived everything else. "You chose this," she said. Damien nodded. "I chose you." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Because they had already been proven in fire, in loss, in everything he had burned to make sure she would never belong to that world again. Claire reached out, her hand brushing his, not holding, not stopping, just touching, a moment that didn't try to last longer than it could. "Then don't regret it," she said. Damien almost smiled. "I won't." The door opened behind her. Time didn't wait. It never had. Claire stepped back, not because she wanted to leave, but because she understood that staying would change nothing about what had already been decided. She turned once more at the doorway, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time, there was no shadow between them. No power. No fear. Just truth. Then she walked away. Damien didn't follow. He didn't call her name. He didn't try to stop what came next. Because for the first time in his life, he had already done everything he needed to do. The city moved on. The system didn't rebuild. Not the same way. Not in the dark. And somewhere beyond the reach of everything that had once defined her, Claire finally understood what her mother had tried to protect all along. Not a secret. Not a weapon. But a choice. And Damien Moretti had burned an empire to give it back to her. Claire didn't look back again because some endings don't need witnesses and some choices don't need to be explained. The door closed between them with a quiet finality that didn't echo but settled, like something irreversible finally finding its place. Damien remained where he stood, unmoving, not broken, not empty, but still in a way that meant something inside him had finally stopped fighting, not against the world, not against power, but against himself. Outside, Manhattan kept breathing. Lights flickering across glass towers, people moving, deals being made, lives continuing as if nothing had changed, but everything had, because the man who once controlled the unseen had chosen to disappear from it. No empire, no leverage, no shadow left to hide in, only consequence, and for the first time in his life he didn't calculate a way out of it, didn't manipulate it, didn't bend it into something survivable, because this time he had chosen it before it could choose him. For her, miles away, Claire stood at the edge of a world that no longer defined her, the weight she had carried for years finally shifting, not disappearing, but transforming into something sharper, something clearer. She wasn't free in the way people imagined freedom. She was something far more dangerous than that. She could choose, and that was the one thing no system had ever been able to control. Not St. Holdings, not the Moretti bloodline, not the men who built power from silence and fear, not even Damien, because in the end he hadn't lost his empire. He had understood it, seen it for what it really was, something that demanded everything and gave nothing back, something that would have taken her too if he had let it, and so he burned it. Not for revenge, not for redemption, but because keeping it meant losing the only thing that had ever made him question it, and that was the difference. That was why it ended, not in chaos, not in victory, but in choice, the one thing no empire survived.